Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Last week, we aired an interview with two activists from Earth Care and Yucca, Seneca Johnson and Miguel Acosta. It was a most informative discussion. Today, I will be speaking with James Jimenez, Executive Director of Voices for Children, one of our favorite ally organizations. We'll have lots to talk about related to the state budget, the urgent need to diversify our revenue base and free ourselves of a most unhealthy dependence on gas and oil revenues. We will also discuss some of the changes in the New Mexico legislature, especially as relates to tax and revenue legislation. Before we get to James, though, I have a few short announcements. Just to keep our listeners posted on my progress in recovering from the July 21st stroke, I continue to improve on a daily basis with increased stamina and more clarity being among the more prominent improvements. The speech, occupational, and physical therapy I receive at Christus St. Vincent is central to my continued improvement. I can't say enough positive about them. None of this would be possible, however, if it weren't for Roxanne, who ignored my I'm fine, don't call 911, I'm not having a stroke. Without that, I'd be without much hope of recovering. She ignored me. But I am now told that I have a complete recovery in my future. So thank you, Roxanne, one day at a time and onward. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this interview on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such great stewards of that land, of this land, and models for all of us as to how we should care for the world. I also want to remind you that the 2022 legislative session is a bit over 2 months away, and Retake will be again operating our legislative alert system. As in the past, if you sign up for our alerts, anytime one of our transformational bills is scheduled for a hearing, we send you an alert that includes a summary of the bill, speaking points, and contact info for your legislator. This year, in part due to the stroke limiting my capacity, we will limit the number of bills we support to far fewer than the 45 we had last year. And also, it's a short session, so there won't be nearly as much action as there has been in the last session. You can sign up for the alerts by going to our homepage at retakeourdemocracy.org and looking for the red sign up button on the right side of the homepage. And we have important news on the proposed PNM Avangrid merger. Roxanne and I were fed up with PNM's I'm in ads so ubiquitous on the airways. We bridle whenever we see them because they use paid actors to parent misinformation about the benefits of the proposed PNM Avangrid merger. And just because they have more money than God and no scruples about lying and spreading misinformation, the power of money can paint a bleak reality as a rosy future and make what is false appear true. It pissed us off, so we decided to produce our own retake video, I'm Out, using volunteers to provide real information on who Avangrid Iberdrola really is and why this merger would be so catastrophic for New Mexico. On Thursday, October 14th, we published a post that included the video and outlined all that is wrong with this deal and how public power would be a far greener, more democratic alternative. Public power would provide New Mexico with much more reliable energy at a cheaper rate, while also preserving the state's capacity to cultivate our own gas and solar and export it to other states and even to Mexico, thereby diversifying our state economy and our revenue base. We need many people to review this video and the post that surrounds it, as it also includes contact information for your PRC members. We need to ensure commissioners hear from us before they vote on the merger sometime in November. So go to retakeourdemocracy.org and check out this blog. It appears at or very near the top of our homepage. Please share it with everyone you know, particularly with influencers you may know, like state legislators, city council members, and members of key commissions, as sadly their emails and calls can have an even greater impact than input from mere ratepayers. If you're interested in learning more about how the legislature works and how you can raise your voice more effectively, you should participate in our weekly legislative huddles that will begin begin in the first week of November. Zoom strategy huddles are held every Friday from 3:30 to 4:30, and these sessions are really important opportunities for you to learn how the legislature really unfolds, where the levers of power are, and how we can advocate effectively in this environment. You can sign up for these sessions at our homepage, click on New Mexico legislation in the menu bar, and a sign-up link can be found in the top of that page. And lastly, if you're driving around and miss any of this show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of it and any prior interview by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the Actions and Events menu. Scroll down to the link to Retake Conversations, where all our shows reside. That's more than enough announcements. I'm exhausted. Let's get started. The easy part is the interview. Let's get started. Welcome, James. We've had Amber, Bill, and Paige on the show before, but this is our maiden voyage. Welcome. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Paul. Really nice to hear that you're feeling so much better. Your recovery prospects are great. And yeah, it's great to be here to be able to talk with you about Voices for Children and some of the things that we're working on that have actually been part of my work life for over 30 years now.
Yeah. Well, if you could speak up just a little bit or move a little closer to the microphone, because you're a little dim. So I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So can you tell us a little bit about how you wound up at Voices for Children and becoming such a strong advocate for children and economic justice?
Sure, it's been, quite a journey for me. I started my professional career in 1986 working for the Department of Finance and Administration at that time. I did that for about 3 years and went to work for the legislature for 5 years and back to DFA for a little while. And then I took a break from state government and went to city government here in Rio Rancho where I lived. And then Governor Richardson asked me to be his DFA secretary. And so I did that for about 3.5 years and then went to be his chief of staff for another couple of years and then back to Rio Rancho. And it was during the time that I worked for Governor Richardson that I met Veronica Garcia, whom, of course, Santa Fe residents know as the former, recently retired superintendent of schools there.
Right.
And Veronica had actually gotten the job at Voices as being the ED. And she called me up one day and I said, "What?" And she said, "Come to," and I said, "No, I'm not going to." Didn't let her get the words out yet. "Leave me alone. I'm kind of retired now. Don't want to do this." She said, "No, no, no. I just want you to serve on a committee." And I said, "You tell me the terms." And she said, "I'll agree to them." So I said, "Okay, let's go for half time for 1 year commitment. I'll do that." That was almost 8 years ago now, and since
Long
the
half
time,
year.
yeah,
Be careful
I
what
don't
you
know how to
say
count
yes
very
to.
well. Yeah, so it was really Veronica Garcia who got me interested in working with Voices. Okay, of course, I knew about the organization because they'd come in and had lobbied me as chief of staff and DFA secretary, but I had never worked in the nonprofit sector, and it really has been the joy of my career. I tell people this is the best job I've ever had, and I truly mean that. It's just been such a remarkable journey.
Well, I think I want to give you another question to tell us a little bit about, in the unlikely event any of our listeners don't know Voices. Can you just tell them a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, we do what's called research-based advocacy. And what that means is that, well, let me back up for a second. We were formed 34 years ago by pediatricians who believed there needed to be a voice particularly at the state level, on issues that impacted children and families. What they were talking about was the social determinants of health. And so that's how we had our start, trying to understand the social conditions that were impacting the health of their patients. We've grown over the years. We are now a staff of 14, and what we do is we work in the areas of health, education, and then a very broad area of family economic security. And then we also do more and more. We've been doing environmental and conservation work, and most of our work takes place with the state legislature or with the executive branch of government. But we also do a little bit of federal work, and we also do a little bit of local government work.
Okay, okay. Well, I always tell everybody who will listen that you guys are the most reliable resource on tax and revenue information in the state. And what's important to me especially is the way you weave in social justice and racial and equity into that analysis, because it's not just numbers. Those budgets are moral documents, you know?
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's the way we look at budgets too. They really are moral documents, and they're a values exercise. I do a lot of teaching, at least do a lot of teaching for the municipal league prior to the pandemic, and that would be sort of my leading statement that elected officials, city, county, federal, state level, all need to think about budgets as value statements because they do set priorities, and it tells people what it is we value and what it is we don't value when we're not
Exactly.
investing in the right things.
Exactly. So in preparation for this interview, I reviewed your most recent policy brief on the state budget and the need to diversify our revenue base. Just how perilous is our reliance on gas and oil revenues?
You know, Paul, when I started my career in 1986, it was the fall of 1986. It was a time when natural gas prices were about $1.25, or even lower than that per thousand cubic feet. Oil was trading at $10 to $15 a barrel, and it was just a really difficult time. It was right at the end of the Nye administration. The state budget was in shambles because of the reliance that had been built on oil and gas to fund the basics, which are, in our mind, it's health, it's education, it's environmental protection, it's our criminal justice system, all of that. That was in 1986, and things haven't changed much, right? We've continued to ride that roller coaster of oil and gas, doing really well in our state budget when oil prices are high or there's high demand, and when natural gas prices are high. My colleague Paige Knight found this incredible graphic that shows these jagged lines that show the ups and downs of oil and gas in terms of the contribution to funding those really basic things that we need to grow New Mexico. And it's really a remarkable chart because it shows that how unreliable building the base budget on oil and gas truly is. And we've been through this multiple times. Most recently, we've seen during 2008 to 2018, during the Great Recession, we saw that we had to slash. We didn't have to actually. The choices that we made
Right.
were to cut oil and to cut public school spending. We cut higher ed contributions by pretty much more than any other state in the country. Contributions to support our health system. For example, school-based health centers really took a big hit during that time period. All the really basics that our state needs if we're going to address those same kind of social conditions that our founders had identified back in 1984. So when they formed Voices for Children, so it's been a perilous time. And about 3 years ago, we became much more vocal. We had voices became much more vocal about the need to reduce this over reliance on oil and gas. And we haven't made the kind of progress that we would have hoped, but we are making a bit of progress by continuing to talk about the volatility of the oil and gas industry and why doesn't serve the best interest of the Mexicans.
Right, right. Well, I wrote a blog that will publish tomorrow, and it's largely based on your great work. So, or Paige's great work. Hats off to Paige.
That's off to
Um,
Paige. Thank you.
how does this reliance imperil thoughtful public policy making, especially as relates to education and and child welfare?
Well, what we've seen over time is when the state was doing well because there was a lot of money coming into the state from tax revenues from oil and gas. We've seen that we have made policy decisions that did things like slash the corporate income tax, for example, and we've slashed the personal income tax, all under the notion that those were kind of necessary if we were going to build a stronger economy in New Mexico. That whole trickle down fallacy that has been repeated over and over for far too long. And because of that, we've been we've actually built in even more of an over reliance on the
Right.
volatile revenues of the oil and gas industry. And then when oil and gas prices fall off, you see what happens. Let the legislators feel like they have no choice but to slash spending. In our mind, that isn't the only choice, of course. So we can restructure our tax code to make it much more reliable, much more stable. And that's really what we've been working at now for several years in trying
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
build stronger coalitions around that very issue.
So I hadn't thought of the public policy aspect of, well, we've got so much money, we might as well cut these taxes on corporations. I was thinking more about the impact it has on child serving institutions and systems, because, they need to be able to recruit and retain staff. And if they're going through ups and downs every couple of years, they wind up losing good staff. And they also, they operate in a system. So they're relying on other organizations that then start to fall apart as well. And you just can't plan that way, and you can't offer quality services.
Well, that's right. I mean, and that's, what we hear all the time from the private sector is business values stability. Well, our big institutions like education, like healthcare, also really value stability. And stability means being able to rely upon the revenues that they are able to generate to make sure that not only that you can plan for today and the next 5 years, but for 10 and 15 years, and that we actually are investing in an education system that's building the kinds of skills and knowledge that a 21st century economy really does need.
So at the risk of asking a really stupid question, why is it then so important that the state diversify its revenue base?
Well, I think that there's multiple answers to that. And let me start with the political answer. I mean, I think that the oil and gas industry, because of their sheer size, the sheer amount of money they have to influence public policy, has been has had a negative impact on public policy decisions that are being made. I think it's really important that we reduce that reliance and that our political system reduce its reliance upon those dollars that I think, in my mind, somewhat distort the decisions that get made to support our children and families. So that would be the political answer. I think the economic answer is that when we are so beholden on one particular industry, particularly in two parts of the state. That's been true in the southeast and the northwest. What we've seen is high instability in families and the economy, meaning jobs, over time. And so families are not able to rely upon sort of good paying jobs with benefits that all of us would like to have. So I think from an economic perspective, it's kind of distorted our thinking. This over reliance has been distorting our thinking about kind of how we should build and can build a, a more diversified economy. From a child and family well-being perspective, it's just as you stated, Paul, that how in the world can we provide continued strong programs like early childhood education, for example, preparing children to be successful in school, making sure that we have culturally and linguistically appropriate education and trained educators that can provide that kind of education in our K through 12 system. And then on the other side, on the higher ed, making sure that our institutions of higher ed really are able to really have their finger on the pulse of kind of what it is that New Mexico needs to diversify its economy. So I think that there's a political rationale for it, there's an economic rationale for it, and certainly from a child and family well-being perspective, there's a really compelling rationale.
I guess it wasn't such a dumb question anyway,
No,
because that
not
was a
at
great
all.
response. Sorry, James, I got to take a quick break here just to remind our listeners that this is KSFR, and that KSFR is more important than ever these days of misinformation and COVID. It offers timely news and alerts and a wide range of programming to keep you sane and well informed. So for those of you who can afford it, please consider making a contribution and think of it as your ticket to admission to a wealth of good programming. You can just go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button. And I think that's a good investment in our future. Today I'm speaking with James Jimenez. He's the executive director of Voices for Children. And let's get back to James. We'll get to some of the revenue policies listed in the Voices policy brief in just a moment, but I first wanted to get your view on two policy options that make sense to retake in many of our allies. The first is for the state to view almost all G&O revenue as one-time monies, to be invested only in one-time expenditures like infrastructure, et cetera, bridges, roads, and so forth. To balance the budget each year, legislators would no longer be able to sustain the boom or bust revenue cycle by relying on gas and oil revenue to fill in the blanks, but would then have to turn to some of the revenue strategies for which Voices has advocated to balance the budget for years. And G&O revenues would fix roads, bridges, and waterways and expand broadband in rural communities. Has this ever been proposed? And what is your view on the idea?
Yeah, it's been talked about. I don't know that I've ever seen legislation on it. Um, it's a compelling idea, certainly for environmental reasons, as we begin continued, actually not begin, but continue the phase out of kind of an oil-based economy, not only in New Mexico, but around the country and around the world. Here's the concerns that we have had at Voices for Children about the idea. One is that we're talking about replacing the nature of $2.5 to $3 billion on a $7 billion budget, which is really, really significant. The dislocation that could potentially cause in the short run, if the legislature is not really willing to make the hard choices on fully replacing that $2.5 to $3 billion, really in a 1 year time period, could be significant. It would mean more cuts to our education system. Between higher ed and public education and early childhood education, we're talking about over 60% of the state's budget. The other area that would take a big hit would be healthcare. Certainly, these are not days in which I think anyone wants us to see cutting back on investments in healthcare. So, Paul, for us, it's really a timing issue, right? We are supportive of the notion of reducing our reliance on oil and gas, and I do like the idea that part of that becomes directing some of those oil and gas revenues to those kinds of non-recurring expenditures, and so that we do continue to reduce that reliance. I think it's something that we ought to continue to talk about and build towards over time. But I think in the short run, we'd have to think carefully about just exactly how it's implemented.
Okay, fair enough. The second policy Retake is proposing is more of a long-term strategy that would be a timely option for the 2022 session, particularly given the boom in G&O revenues we're experiencing right now. Specifically, we're working with Renewable Taos, the Land Office, and New Energy Economy to press the state to invest in a study of how it might buy out our existing private utility monopolies and create public power in New Mexico. By using our vast resources to secure low interest loans and use those funds to build out our nearly limitless wind and solar resources, augment them with new storage technology, and then build the transmission lines necessary to sell that power to other states in New Mexico, we would create a significant source of green and sustainable revenue. Is this a strategy you feel that the state should at least study?
So, yeah, I absolutely do believe it's an issue that should be studied. As you were reading the question, I was thinking about sort of what are what is it, what's necessary in today's economy and, in a 21st century, not economy, but also society to be successful and to be fulfilling to us. And it's we know that there's Maslow's hierarchy and all of those things that are necessary, but there's also some basic infrastructure things that are necessary: roads, water, sewer, electricity, broadband, right, is part of that. And we've seen the really negative implications during this pandemic about the inadequate broadband facilities. Part of that has to do with the fact that we've had these investor-owned utilities in New Mexico that have not built out the systems in a way that would allow everyone all across the state of New Mexico to have uh, high-speed broadband access. So
Or
it
even
seems to,
electricity.
well, right? I mean, electricity is part of that, right? I mean, for most of us anyway, not for everybody, but for most of it, it is. And I think that I think one can make a very compelling argument that maybe the days of investor-owned utilities we should say goodbye to, because as we know, in a capitalist economy, whose interests are going to be served first, and those interests, even though they're regulated, right? Still, it's the investors whose interests are going to be served first.
Exactly.
I mean, that's why I think that it's time for us to be thinking about whether or not we ought to be producing, electricity in a very different kind of way. The during the Richardson years, uh, the governor created the transmission authority, and the intention of the transmission authority was actually to be able to expand solar and wind so that we could be a net exporter of electricity. During the Martinez years, because that was a Richardson idea, she basically dismantled the transmission authority, and it really progress on that stalled. And so I think all of those things can work hand in hand towards building a more viable economy that's less reliant on oil and gas. And I think this could be an important part of it.
Well, if you're interested, I can send you some information because I did a pretty extensive blog on this based on the work of the American Public Power Institute. And basically, they created a whole guide for how a city, a county, or a state could create their own public power. And it's pretty impressive. And, it actually just lays out what you need to know and who needs to do what to make it happen and the potential that is involved. It's pretty remarkable. So we're going to move on to your policy brief instead of ours. You close your policy brief with an extensive list of options for generating a more diverse and sustainable revenue base, most of which involves some kind of increase of taxes or fees, or closing of loopholes, or reversing costly but ineffective corporate giveaways long overdue for being retired. Retake supports every one of them. Of the list of revenue generating strategies you identified in your policy brief, which have the potential for generating the most revenue?
Well, the ones that we've been most focused on the last few years, and I think that um, kind of would provide the best opportunity are the income taxes. And there I'm talking about personal income taxes and corporate income taxes in particular. We slashed the corporate income tax under Governor Martinez, and with the promise, of course, that some magic happens when you do that, and all of a sudden everyone has a great job with benefits. And
I'm going to
they
have to
never did it.
interrupt you, James, because I let you go too long. We're at the end of the show. So can you just give everybody the website for Voices, and we'll continue the conversation for the podcast?
You bet. Yeah, people would like more information, they can go to www.nmvoices.org.
Okay, thank you very much, James, and we'll continue the conversation in just a minute. And to all our KSFR listeners, we'll be back next week. My crystal ball doesn't tell me what we're going to be seeing though. So stay tuned, stay active, and stay healthy. It's the only way we're going to fix this mess. Bye-bye. Okay, I'm sorry I interrupted you. You were on a roll. And so do you want to continue your discussion of what would be the most uh, uh, productive of those policy briefs, policy options?
Yeah, yeah. There's, well, clearly to us, the personal and corporate income taxes are the ones that ought to be addressed first. And, um, for some really compelling reasons. One is that you can structure those in a way that are progressive, and which simply means that those that earn the most pay the most. You can structure them in a way that they're not harmful to low to moderate income working families. You can export some of the taxes to shareholders of corporations by making them pay for the cost of everything that they are able to take advantage of in our economy. And that's, a trained workforce, it's water, it's oil, it's natural gas, it's roads, it's all of the things that are necessary for companies to be successful in the state. And I do believe that they have a responsibility to helping to pay for those things. So I think for policy reasons as well as for reasons that they generate the most money, those are the places we ought to start.
Okay. Of the list of revenue generating strategies identified in your policy brief, which has the potential for generating the most political support?
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that question is kind of the short-term, long-term question. We have been, a couple of years ago, we were able to get some changes enacted to the personal income tax code that added some brackets at the top end. That had took us many years to build towards that, but I still think what we were able to show legislators was that our tax system is substantially unfair to low and moderate income working families, and that if they really wanted to make the system fair, then they needed to go where the money was, and that's what they did. We were really pleased that even though they really whittled down what we had proposed, they still endorsed it. We came back this last legislative session and had some more of those things built into it. They didn't pass, but we heard sort of surreptitiously that there was some interest in continuing to look at personal income taxes as a way of generating the kind of more stable revenue that we need for our state general fund.
So let's talk a bit about how historically the legislature has reacted to increasing taxes or fees. It seems there is never the right time to take steps to diversify our revenue base. If we're in a boom cycle, then it's just unfair at this time to go and tax people more. And
Mhm.
if we're in a bust cycle, it's not a good time to do it then either. And right now, I'm anticipating it's a COVID cycle, so it won't be a good time to do it either. How do you counter those arguments?
Well, part of the way we do it, and I think what you've described, Paul, is that um, those are kind of artifacts of the short-term thinking that our political system feels like it needs to reward. And frankly, I don't believe that. And I think we voices just don't believe that when you make the case that the short-term thinking that has generated that the notion that we can never raise taxes anytime, anywhere, on anybody, then you can make it clear that they are doing a disservice to the people that they are supposed to represent. So one of the things that we need to do is just kind of connect the dots between a stable general fund and what that means for that legislator's school district, or for teachers in their district, or for healthcare in their district. So we've got to make it sort of really, really local for them. That's one way we do it. The other is that we, continue to remind them what's happened during the last 3 or 4 times when we've had these cycles of boom and bust in the oil and gas industry. They've ended up slashing budgets. They didn't need to, but that's the path that they chose to took. Reminding those decision makers on House appropriations and the Senate Finance Committee of the really devastating impact that those cuts have had in their districts and statewide, is another key piece of it. And the third thing is getting more people involved in talking about taxes with legislators is vitally important. You know, as you know, Paul, there's times when they get tired of hearing from us at Voices and they want to hear from their constituents. I mean, we've heard that. We don't want to hear from you. We want to hear from our constituents. We say, fine, we can deal with that. And we will work with their constituents to get their voice heard. And that's vitally important for changing that kind of short term thinking.
Well, we'll try and do our part on that. Anytime you come up with a policy brief, it makes my life easy. I just excerpt quotes and put a few sentences in, and we've got a brilliant analysis of our tax, the possibilities for tax reform. The 2022 session comes just before another race for governor, not historically a time when incumbent Dems are receptive to raising taxes. How will you balance your advocacy for policies in which you believe strongly while maintaining a positive relationship with the governor? Have you had preliminary discussions with the governor? And if so, have you identified some appetite for some of what you propose?
Well, first I'd say that I have not spoken directly with the governor, no. But we have talked with some of the cabinet and some of the members of the governor's office staff. And I would say that um, I think 2022 is going to be a difficult time to enact the kind of tax policy legislation that we would like to see. On the other hand, I would say that we've seen great receptivity to uh, understanding more about why we are proposing what we are proposing and what the benefits would be to the state. One of the things that I've really been overjoyed really to see has been the governor's focus on children and family issues in a way that I'm not sure we've really ever seen from a governor. And I think that what the governor is looking for, if I can interpret it from what I've seen and heard, is that looking for a way to be reelected to continue a strong child and family focused policy agenda. We hope that tax policy choices become a part of that. One of them might be a child tax credit, for example, that would not require raising taxes, but would continue to make our tax system fair by providing a tax break for low and moderate income working families with children. So those are the kinds of things we've been talking about.
Okay. So we also have, as if you don't have enough things to juggle in the legislature in 2022, we have some important changes in the legislature that will impact your work, particularly the elevation of a strong ally, Javier Martinez, from chair of Tax and Rev to a member of the leadership. How do you see that playing out? Do you have any word as to who is likely to rise to the new chair? And what benefits do you see to having Javier in leadership?
Well, what we've been doing for the past several years is being more overt about the way that we cultivate relations with legislators over a long period of time. And we've been doing that with House and Senate members, and we've had a great response from House members. And we particularly have been focused on those House members that serve on the House Appropriations and Finance Committee and on the House Tax Committee. What that's enabled us to do is to kind of build their knowledge of the rationale for the kinds of tax policies that we have been promoting over time. And we've continued to do that. Amber and Bill just led 2 sessions just a week or so ago on with legislators on getting them to understand where we are today and what we need to do going forward. So to answer your question, we've been working with members of the committee for several years. I think that there are probably 2 or 3 members of the committee that we would love to see as chair of the House Tax Committee, with Javier Martinez as the majority leader. that gives us somebody in a leadership position that knows the kind of work we do, why we do the kind of work we do, and how to do it effectively to get the kind of policy change that we need. So we're pretty excited about that. Um, it remains to be seen. Those are very, very political decisions, and we hope that we see someone who is sympathetic to the idea that we can do better by New Mexicans if we have a fair, more progressive tax system.
Okay, so that's great. So you shared earlier how people on the radio show, but can you tell us a little bit about what people might find on your website and how they can get there?
Yeah, people can reach us at www.nmvoices.org, um, or you can just Google New Mexico Voices for Children and you can find us. We've got a pretty extensive website that has lots of different policy briefs that people can take a look at. Tax policy, healthcare policy, food policy, environmental and conservation policy, becoming, as I said, more important part of the work that we do. Um, and it's also a way to contact us. People ought to feel free to, you can find our contact information there and send us questions or ideas. We love hearing from people. One of the things that we do, Paul, is because we are a kind of what we call a grass tops organization. We do not do any direct service work, and so we really rely upon our supporters as well as our partner organizations for telling us kind of how the policies and issues that they are facing are resonating on the ground. So we love to get that feedback from average New Mexicans.
Well, so one of the things we did in the blog that we're publishing tomorrow, as I said, it borrows liberally from your work, but then it ends with an asking people, telling people that, and you said this in the interview, that the legislators want to hear from constituents, and constituents, tax policy can be really daunting and also kind of boring if you don't see the connections
Mm-hmm.
between the numbers and people. And I think you do such a good job of that. At the end of the blog, I said that, if you're going to be advocating with your legislature, one of the things you can do to educate yourself so that you're prepared to counter arguments that are, disingenuous maybe or misinformed, is to spend some time. And I referenced specifically the policy brief that you have a link to in the last policy brief, where you go into much more detail on each of the different policies you advocate for and why. And so it's just encouraging people, if you're going to be an advocate, you got to put in the time and be in a position where you can speak forcefully and in an informed way. So, well, I hope that we're going to be doing some of this work next year in person and run into each other in the hall. And let's make it more frequent on the radio show.
Let's do. And, Paul, one of the things I just wanted to let you know and let your listeners know is that come January 1st, Amber Wallen will become the executive director of New Mexico Voices for Children. So she'll be running the C3 side of New Mexico Voices for Children. And I'll be stepping away from that role and I'll be running the C4 side of where we'll be involved in direct advocacy and some electoral campaigns for the 2022 election cycle.
Is
So
that
maybe
going to
we
be another
schedule.
part-time job for you for 6 months?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Maybe at some point we schedule a conversation about what a C3 and a C4 can do together on changing the makeup of our legislature as well as doing policy work.
It'd be a good conversation because Retake's doing the same thing. We started out as a C4 and now are transitioning to create a C3 because most of what we do is C3 work. Very little of it is C4. And so, we're hamstrung in terms of getting funding so that we can actually have a staff. And we want to have a staff at some point so that Roxanne and I can step back a little bit. We thought this was a 6-month job too. And it's been a 5-year job, but a gratifying one. The best job I've ever had, unpaid job. So In any case, thanks for joining us today, James, and have a great day and a great weekend.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Always good to talk to you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Sorry about the weekend reference. I was thinking we were recording this the day before the show. It's actually Monday when we recorded this. So take care, James.
All right. We'll see you.